It is my great pleasure to welcome you at the Central European Research Institute for Art History. And it's an even greater honor for us to welcome here Nicholas Fox-Weber, the Executive Director of the Anni and Josef Albers Foundation. And I think it's an extraordinary occasion to talk about so important oeuvres like the oeuvre of the Albers couple that made a huge impact on Hungarian artists as well, like Imre Bak or Dora Maurer and others, I mean, in the Hungarian scene. And the work of Josef Albers, or one of the nicest works of Josef Albers, is among the highlights of the Museum of Fine Arts, the institute to which CEMKI, so the Central European Research Institute for Art History, also belongs. So for us, it is an incredibly wonderful occasion to discuss these oeuvres, and we are very, very happy to welcome you here. And I'd like to invite Zoltán Balázs Tóth to introduce the lecture and who will moderate this event. And I wish you a wonderful evening in the name of the Museum of Fine Arts and the Central European Research Institute for Art History.
Thank you for the nice words of David. Good evening to all. And I would like to briefly introduce our speaker, Mr. Nicholas Fox-Weber, one of the outstanding scholars in the history of art. Nicholas Fox-Weber is a writer, cultural historian, the executive director of the Josef and Anni Albers Foundation, and also the president of the non-profit organization American Friends of La Corza, which was founded by himself with the support of the Josef and Anni Albers Foundation. He's a graduate of Columbia College, BA, major in art history, Yale University, MA, art history, and he received his PhD from the University of Groningen. Nicholas Fox-Weber is the author of 14 books, including the Bauhaus Group, Le Corbusier, and the drawings of Josef Albers. He currently works, beside other works, on a biography of Anni Albers for Yale University Press. As the executive director of the Josef and Anni Albers Foundation, Nicholas Fox-Weber has written extensively about each artist and has curated many major exhibitions and retrospectives of their work. In his lecture, which quotes the title of the 1939 painting, Equal and Unequal, he will focus primarily on the Hungarian relations of the Albers couple. He will also discuss the importance of László Moholy-Nagy, Viktor Vasarely, and Marcel Breuer in the lives of the Albers couple. We will gain a detailed and satisfying insight into the Bauhaus era and the creative and pedagogical processes that were mainly associated with the Black Mountain College and the design department of the Yale University. So please welcome Nicholas Fox-Weber.
Thank you so much for this wonderful greeting and for giving me the opportunity to be here and for the welcome that I have felt in the past 2 days, which is remarkable. In particular, and I may be forgetting certain names, I'd like to thank, and I'm just using first names, very American style, David and Balázs and Zoltán and Monica and Georg, or George, who was incredibly helpful in the last-minute mechanics of setting up this lecture. There's one person I'd like to thank more than anyone else, and that's Christina McLean, who is entirely responsible for my being here. And she's already provided me with a couple of extraordinary days. I'm traveling with my daughter Charlotte, who's an old friend of Christina's, and what Christina has done on behalf of the Alberses is to me just absolutely remarkable. So, profuse thanks. Anni was one of the most captivating people in the world. Very witty, very full of life, as you can see here in this late photograph of her. A remarkable artist. And Josef was dynamic, charismatic, incredibly certain of himself, and passionate for showing color. They wanted to make the world a better place. It was quite simple. They wanted people to enjoy themselves, to enjoy the experience of seeing, to know the wonders that are afforded by looking at great art. Anni was best known as a weaver. She took thread and gave it its voice. She told me that her great teacher, Paul Klee, had said to her to take a line for a walk, and she thought that idea was so great that she decided to take thread where she could. And Josef, as you know, is best known for his paintings, The Homages to the Square. He painted over 3,000 of them. There's a catalog raisonné currently in the works. There are also about 65 fakes out there in the world. The forgeries keep me particularly busy. I'm in and out of courtrooms, which wasn't what I expected when I first met Anni and Josef over 50 years ago. And Josef, with these squares, gave color its voice, but he did a great deal before then as well. They lived in such simplicity. And when I was first taken to meet them, I knew I was going to the house of Anni and Josef Albers, and I pictured something from the Bauhaus. White, flat roof, quite extreme looking, maybe some stainless steel or pipes or something like that. And instead, I was driven to this really rather ordinary American raised ranch house, which they lived in because it allowed them to work. It was very simple. They had very few objects. They lived austerely. And there's something quite fascinating about why they chose this house in Orange, Connecticut. They had decided, by the time Anni was in her 70s and Josef in his 80s, that they wanted to be buried together. So they went to find the prettiest cemetery near to where they lived in New Haven, Connecticut. And they discovered that it was in a town called Orange. Josef thought it was very funny that a town was called Orange because there was a sign which would say, "This is Orange," and it was painted green. Perfect for Albers, who loved the discrepancies and nuances of color. And to be in the Orange Cemetery, they had to have a residence there. And their theory was that whichever of them died first, the other would go in the car, roll down the car window next to the grave of the person who had died, read the mail, possibly chat about it, and then drive home. I said that the house was very austere. You see here Anni's bedroom on your right with the painting, Equal and Unequal, which was referred to so nicely in the introduction this evening and which we'll get to again. And then you see this really rather plain living room, inexpensive sofas, an industrial rug, and a lighting fixture. Anni told me that it was so difficult to find a lighting fixture that was simple enough that she went to an outdoor furniture store and got an outdoor lighting fixture that had a lot of white metal flowers around it. She removed all the white metal flowers so that she could have the pure cylinder that she wanted. There were some pretty wonderful moments in this house. Simple as it looks, undramatic. I well remember the arrival of the textile artist Sheila Hicks. Many of you know her work. I was there for the visits of John Cage, who was enthralled with Annie and she with him, and he would arrive with a macrobiotic lunch of special peanut butter. It was a house that had its share of interesting life. Perhaps, and it's a bit of name dropping, but perhaps none was more enjoyable than the time that Jacqueline Onassis arrived here, and she walked in, and I introduced her to Annie, and then Jackie just looked and said, "Just like the Matisse Chapel in Vence, all the white and then the color." And I thought nobody could have fed her that line. This was someone who really saw. Annie, in a very grand way, said to Jackie, "Mrs. Onassis, do you know what the Bauhaus is?" And Jackie replied, "Oh, I'm so honored, Mrs. Albers, this is wonderful." And then Jackie looked at her and said, "I lived in a White House once too." Josef, born in Bottrop in Westphalia, an industrial city. He was born in 1888. His father was a house painter, carpenter, craftsman. And Josef started out as a school teacher. What was little known during his lifetime is that he was an amazing figurative artist before he went to the Bauhaus. And after he died, I'm sorry because I jumped back and forth from their lifetimes from the beginning to more recent times, but after he died, Annie gave me a bunch of keys, and we went in the car to New Haven, Connecticut, near to where they lived, and she said, "Nick, there must be a room with Joseph's things in it downstairs in this building, because sometimes I drive him here, he goes in with something and comes out with nothing, or he goes in with nothing and comes out with something." And she told me that she couldn't make it down the stairs. She had a very difficult physical disorder called Charcot-Marie-Tooth syndrome, which affected her life in many ways, so she never talked about it. And I took this bunch of keys, and there were 5 doors and about 10 keys, and I think it was on the 33rd attempt to get a key into a lock that I opened the door of a room that was perhaps a third the size of this lecture space, and the first thing that I saw was a letter from Paul Klee with a drawing. My knees went absolutely wobbly, and then I found drawings upon drawings which Josef had labeled my early figurative work. And you can see that as a figurative artist, he had the qualities that we know from him with the homages to the square. The idea of minimal means for maximum effect. There are very few lines here. There's even a degree of interaction, if you will. So if you think of an Albers of 4 squares, you see each square separately, and you see them in relation to each other. And here you see each goose separately, and then in relation to one another. He had an amazing eye and great skill. I also found in that room this drawing, which I have to tell you, having known Josef for a few years, and then this was shortly after he died that I found this, it would be as if you had a very strict Victorian grandfather and then found his erotic correspondence or something like that, because it didn't take me long to realize that the figure we see from behind is Josef. The shape of the head, the build, very much Josef. And he was in every way, and this was true throughout his life, a sensualist. And he's misunderstood by people who don't see that quality of great warmth. Now, this talk is going to be going in several different directions because I'm going to bring in some of the great Hungarian artists who were named in the introduction, and they'll appear in cameos throughout the talk. And this is Vasarely, who I will show you some work by Vasarely in relation specifically to some work by Josef and then some work by Anni. Now, I'm not claiming a historical connection. I'm not saying that Albers influenced Vasarely or that Vasarely influenced Albers, although they were shown together and both were shown by Denise René in Paris. But what I am very aware of is their common interests. And part of it was the wonderful play that you can get of black and white. If you look at this drawing, it's Josef's earliest extant drawing from 1911 of the church in a town called Stadtlohn, where Josef taught in a one-room school. And if you look at this drawing, look at the windows at the bottom. Some of them have black mullions and the glass looks white. Some of them have white mullions and the glass looks black. Everything is about the wonderful experience, a very primal experience, of playing in black and white. I once asked Josef what his earliest memory was from childhood, and he said it was going to the post office with his mother. There was a sort of marble checkerboard floor of black and white tiles, and he said he loved jumping from tile to tile, a natural thing that many people do. And this is an Albers from 1933, where he's still playing the rhythm of black and white, positive space and negative space. And here is a later work by Vasarely. But you can see the common interests, as I say, not a direct influence, but a love for visual rhythm, a love for the excitement that occurs when we put black and white next to each other in an exciting and rhythmic way. And then consider that Vasarely in relation to this glass construction from Josef. I have a rather personal story about this work. One of the things I did in the summer after Josef Albers died in 1976 was to clean the garage. Ordinary thing, most of us have to do it a few times in our lives. And Josef had stacks of wonderful wooden orange crates and things that were in them, like motor oil and whatever one has in a garage. And an upholstered envelope fell hard onto my chest. And I looked inside it, and there was this work, which in reality is only about so big. And I took it upstairs, and I showed it to Anni. And I said, look at what I just found. And she said, oh, that was when I first met Josef. He would go to the town dump in Weimar. He was too poor to buy art supplies. And so he hacked up bottle fragments and detritus and made these magical works. Light passing through colored glass. What an absolutely beautiful thing. This was a man who had made a stained glass window in a church in Bottrop, in his hometown. He loved the miracle of light adding to color in such a particularly rich way. Then Josef took his glass constructions in a new direction. He began to use the method of sandblasting to get effects of the type that you see in these glass works. And what's remarkable here is that what you're looking at in these two glass works from 1926 is in each case the same graphic construction. They're made from stencils. There's no difference in the lines. But I think you'll agree with me that the pink square form seems to be a different size than the blue square form. We have different impressions of what's in front and what's in back. We get different rhythm in the works, and this is and a different sense of proportions, and this is all because of color. This was really his first discovery of what could happen when you change the color. Now we look at Annie from a very different world. She was born in 1899 in circumstances of great affluence. In Berlin, her family was Jewish in descendancy, but she had been baptized and eventually confirmed in a Protestant church. She always thought of herself as Jewish, which was significant, of course, with the rise of Nazism eventually in Germany. But she was non-practicing and from a very prominent publishing family called the Ullsteins on her mother's side, and on her father's side, a furniture-making family called the Fleischmanns. Now, Annie's parents thought that she should be brought up to tell the cook what to make for dinner, raise children, and have the role of an upper-class woman who simply lived in luxury. This is a photograph. I was lucky enough to get inside Annie's old apartment, or her childhood apartment in Berlin. This is not the original furniture, but it's very much the flavor of the world in which Anni Albers grew up. She never was allowed in the kitchen. She only learned how to cook when she was 50 years old and then left Black Mountain College, and she was in a place where that was her obligation. In 1922, she got a brochure for the experimental school called the Bauhaus. This immediately grabbed her. The idea of design being of universal benefit. She had already gone to a Kunstgewerbeschule, a school for applied arts in Hamburg. But now she was totally attracted. There was just a small brochure to this idea of design for everyone. She told her father she wanted to go to a school with a new style, and he said, there are no new styles. Remember, he was in the furniture business. We've had the Renaissance, we've had the Baroque, there's nothing left. But Annie persuaded her parents to finance her way of life, and this woman who could have just lived at home waiting for the dressmaker to come, went instead to Weimar, rented a single room. She said that she could only have a bath once a week down the hall. It was a rugged way of life. This portrait of her was taken by László Moholy-Nagy. And in fact, I bought it for the Albers Foundation, and Annie was quite annoyed with me because she said she never liked that haircut. And she used to call the photograph Whistler's mother. But I think there is something wonderful here, and you can feel her remarkable intensity. So she applied for the Bauhaus. She was not admitted. It was a 6-month application process. She had to do various studies. Only 5 of the 16 applicants got in. She was not among them, but she couldn't leave because, as she worded it, she had seen a lean, half-starved, ascetic-looking Westphalian with irresistible blonde bangs. That was Josef. And Josef helped her get through the basic studies so that she could gain admission to the Bauhaus. We were in a conversation earlier before the talk when the name of David Hockney came up. And I'm reminded of the Hockney-Albers relationship because I've just referred to Annie's reference to Joseph's irresistible blonde bangs. In 1973 or 4, I had driven the Alberses to a printmaking workshop in Bedford, New York, so that Joseph could sign a series of late prints. They were the most dignified couple, wonderful to travel with, always interesting, always gracious. And we went in, and Joseph began signing work. And then I realized that way in the other end of the printmaking workshop was David Hockney. And one of the young printmakers looked at me and said, "Oh, shit." And I said, "What's the matter?" And he said, "I don't want Albers to see Hockney. Albers says terrible things about Hockney's work. It'll be great trouble if the two of them meet. David will be respectful, but you know Joseph, he can be really tempestuous." And so there was a great effort to keep Joseph way over on one side of the room, have him at his task, and keep him from seeing David, who was working on a swimming pool, on the other side of the room. And suddenly, Annie turned and said, "Who is that man with blonde bangs? They're just like yuppies," which is what she called Joseph. And the printmaker, who had been so upset that there might be an encounter, said, "That's David Hockney, Annie." And Annie just said, "I must meet him. Get him to come over." Printmakers thought, "Oh my God, this is going to be trouble." David Hockney came over, very gracious, met Annie, and then came the introduction to Joseph. And Annie said, "Yuppie, this man has bangs just the way yours were when I first met you." And Joseph said, "Ah, you're Hockney. Well, you know, you won't get bald. It will turn white, but you'll keep your hair. But it's impossible to brush. You really can't do anything with it. It just falls like that." And then he said, "Hockney, weren't you and I in the newspaper a couple of weeks ago for breaking records for a sale at a place, I think it was called Christie's?" And David said, "Yes, we were both in the New York Times for that sale." And Joseph just said, "Very nice to meet you, Hockney." And that was the entire encounter. Now, Annie, independent as she was, went into the weaving workshop and produced in 1923 this wall hanging, which in reality is about the size of the projected image on the screen. Imagine this woman who grew up with all those ornate patterns around her, clinging to simplicity, right angles, the power of simple forms. And it was her idea that art was a visual resting place. She then went further with this idea of textile making and used straight lines and right angles to create works of amazing rhythm. And then came a first Bauhaus Christmas. And Walter Gropius was Santa Claus, or Father Christmas, and he had a sack of gifts in the front of the room. And Annie knew, this is when she was still new at the Bauhaus, thought there could not possibly be anything for her. Her name was called, and she didn't hear it because she didn't expect to. And the woman next to her nudged her, and Annie went forward. And what came out of Santa's gift bag was a rolled-up print of Giotto's Flight into Egypt from the chapel in Padua. This was a gift from Joseph, the most perfect symbol of their relationship. They loved visual beauty. They loved the idea that color itself was sacred. They loved the balance of forms. They were really like a two-person religious sect with this shared love of certain forms of visual beauty. On her first birthday back in Berlin, Annie said that the doorbell rang, and what was delivered was a copy, just an inexpensive copy, of a Greek 5th century BC statue from Joseph. Another example of balance, restraint, and an eye for beauty. They liked modernism, but modernism wasn't the only thing for them. In 1925, they went to see Annie's parents because Josef was asked to teach at the Bauhaus, which gave him a salary, which meant that Annie could present him to mother and dad and say that they wanted to get married. Well, Annie felt that Josef didn't have the right suit to meet her parents. So in the town of Weimar, she made strands of beads and sold them, which enabled her to go to a good tailor and get Josef the suit that he should have. Now, if you can cut forward in time, I was in the Alberses' kitchen in 1974, sitting as we often did at the very simple Formica table, drinking good strong coffee and eating strudel, when Annie said, "Imagine, Nick, I brought him home, 11 years older than me, Catholic, no money whatsoever, and making these crazy glass constructions." And what do you think my mother said? I didn't know. Josef was beaming, and Annie said, my mother turned to Josef and said, after 15 minutes, she said, "Our Anka is so difficult, and you're so wonderful. You're at home here anytime." And so they were married. They went to Florence for their honeymoon. After that honeymoon, they came back and worked in a way that's reminiscent of some of the Romanesque facades that you see in Florence, with the wonderful striped architecture. You have an Anni Albers weaving on your left, that's a large wall hanging, and on your right, a Josef Albers glass construction. So they were working in a similar vein in 1926. Now, the god for both of them was Paul Klee. He was a friend, he was a neighbor. Annie loved his way of thinking, and what you're seeing here is a very rare object. It's a photo collage that Josef made of his own photographs of Klee. One of those many things that I found in that basement storage room. Now, this is to give you just a quick look at what Klee was doing at the Bauhaus. This is what Annie was doing at the Bauhaus, a child's rug which has magical squares, much the way that Klee's work does. And this is what Josef was doing. Stained glass, a glassmaker's samples put together in this extraordinary work called Grid Mounted. One day, I was driving Annie because we had agreed that she would do some prints at my family's printing company north of Hartford, Connecticut. And as we were in the car driving home, there was a torrential thunderstorm. And Annie said, "You're driving perfectly well, Nick, but would you pull over under a stone bridge and wait for the rain to end?" She said she was just too anxious about the loss of visibility. And we sat there with the rain bucketing down outside, and she said, "You know, you've been very patient. I'm going to tell you something I've never told anyone before." And she told me that when Klee was turning 50, in 1929, she and 3 other women in the weaving workshop had the idea that he should get his birthday presents from above. They felt that Klee was so otherworldly, he didn't live in the same sphere as most of us, and he really should get his gifts to descend from the cosmos. And so various people at the Bauhaus made objects that would go into what was essentially a sort of big piñata-like angel. Annie told me that she made the brass shavings for the angel's hair. And they went to the Junkers aircraft factory, and a pilot agreed to take these 4 weavers up above the Bauhaus so that they could let the gifts fall down. The pilot had a blast. He had an open cockpit. He did 360s. And when I said to Annie, "Oh my God, you must have been terrified," she said, "No, it was fascinating. It gave me a new dimension on everything. I'd always thought of things just in 3 dimensions, and now I was seeing so much more. That was Annie, always the adventurous. And so Clay's gifts descended, and Clay memorialized the experience in this wonderful painting that's now at the Museum of Modern Art called Gifts for Eye. Another fascinating Hungarian in the Albers' life, the weaver Otti Berger. Now, I'm told that she wasn't actually born in Hungary, but she spoke Hungarian and was thought of as Hungarian. You see her on the right and Annie on the left. Otti Berger was Annie's closest friend in the weaving workshop. She brought her home to meet her parents. And on your right, you see a work by Otti, and on your left, another design by Annie, where there is a remarkable similarity. Again, I don't think they were looking over each other's shoulders. I'm not saying that there's a direct influence. I'm saying that they came to very similar ideas about the power of form, the power of right angles, and the wonder of color playing against each other. Annie had a jacket that she made out of old material that Otti Berger gave her. And you might not picture the very austere Anni Albers wearing this, but she made it herself. She once said that she thought the greatest artist of the 20th century was Coco Chanel, and she kept sort of Chanel classic lines, and she treasured this jacket from Otti Berger, except that after the Bauhaus closed, Otti ended up dying at Auschwitz, and Annie, every time she wore the jacket, would have these incredible bittersweet memories of someone who had been one of her closest friends. Now we see Moholy-Nagy. Now, I would be fraudulent if I suggested that Josef Albers and Moholy-Nagy were good friends. They were not. There was a rivalry between them. And a few years ago, Tate Modern did an exhibition of Josef and Moholy together. There are a lot of visual points in common, but they were after different things in their art. Nonetheless, you can see similarities. On your left is a photo collage from Moholy, and on your right, those 2 photographs on cardboard are by Josef. And I still think there is a lot of work to be done on Albers and Moholy-Nagy, particularly the photography, that it's a very rich, untapped subject. And here's an Albers from the late 1920s called Flying, and a Moholy of a similar period, and you certainly can see that they're both interested in translucency, the play of forms over one another, and a certain dynamism and geometric play. And then there was Marcel Breuer, another Hungarian of great importance to the Albers. Josef first met him when he was standing outside the glass workshop, and at that point, according to Josef, didn't speak any German, and Josef gave him a broom and told him that he should sweep up the workshop. And they both told that story, and Breuer made this wonderful etching, which is his portrait of Josef Albers. If you remember that glass construction called grid-mounted, the one that looked like a colorful checkerboard that I showed you with the clays, Josef seems to be carrying it here, and it's really a marvelous image from his friend Breuer. They were both in the furniture workshop. On your left, you see Josef's stacking tables with glass tops, and on your right, Breuer's. So you can certainly see the effect that each had on the other. On the left, the famous Breuer chair, and on your right, one of Josef's armchairs from about the same year. They worked in a similar vein, but differently in their choices of materials and their overall sense of form. Annie went on to get her Bauhaus diploma for a sound-absorbing, light-reflecting material for an auditorium. The Bauhaus had moved from Weimar to Dessau. Josef continued to work in glass, and I'd like you to look at this wonderful glass construction from 1931 because it has a very Albers thing going on in it. If you look at the large form on your right, there's steps that are basically going away from you to the right. If you look on your left, you pretty much follow my finger along the left profile of the small form. It seems to go up and away to the left. But if you look at the right profile, it seems to go down and away to the right. Albers was fascinated with impossibilities. He used to say that in science and math, 1 + 1 + 1 is 3, but in art it can be many things more. And he loved the idea of a form that could not exist in reality. 1933. The Gestapo padlocked the doors of the Bauhaus. Josef was one of the faculty members who agreed that the school had to close rather than comply with the Third Reich in their hope that the artists of the Bauhaus would work in the manner that the Reich wanted. And Annie and Josef met some wonderful New Yorkers from the Museum of Modern Art who arranged for them to go to the United States and begin teaching at Black Mountain College, an experimental new college in North Carolina. This is a newspaper photo that was taken as they got off the ship, the Europa, on November 22nd, 1933. Annie at Black Mountain began to work in a much earthier way, with beautiful textures, still abstract, quite influenced by Mexican and other forms of Latin American art, using weaving to create incredible dynamism. This is a pre-Columbian piece that she owned, and you can see a relationship of that to her own work with these two-headed pythons. Josef was interested in wood grain. He was interested in Mexican gods. He named this Tlaloc for the rain god. A wonderful use of simple forms to get dynamism. And then we get to the painting Equal and Unequal. Josef made it in 1939, and Annie, in her very simple bedroom, had one artwork, and it was this. And it hung over the cabinets that she could see from her bed. She was often bedridden, and she told me that she never could quite figure out how Josef did it, how he got these forms to relate to each other, and how he got the texture to be so extraordinary, and what was going on spatially. She was always engaged by it. One day, after knowing them for many years, it was actually well after Josef died, that I realized looking at this, that for me it was like a portrait of Annie and Josef. Two powerful presences, very strong presences when you met them, very attracted to each other and very resistant to each other. And you could feel so many forces going on. So Equal and Unequal strikes me as a fitting title for something related to this amazing couple. We jump from Equal and Unequal to this Vasarely. I think it's quite clear that there's a visual relationship. I'll just go back there for a moment. There's a visual relationship, if not a historical one. And then we look at what Breuer was doing in America. This was a house that he built near Pittsburgh for some clients called the Franks. Annie did a lot of materials for the house. So Breuer and the Alberses stayed in touch. We look at Albers from 1942. with Vasarely again, because of the visual relationship, the powerful use of lines, the ability to get enormous depth from straight lines on a flat surface. An Anni Albers wall hanging from the late 40s with many of the same qualities. Josef Albers' first painting in a series called The Adobes, based in part on the adobe architecture of the Mexican Southwest. This is a painting we recently acquired at the Foundation. It's difficult to see projected on a screen, but it's called Dark, and I can only tell you that to become absorbed in this painting of Joseph's is one of the thrills of a lifetime. It is so meditative, so subtle, so powerful. There is an equal amount of each color. The gray, and call them grays, call them blacks. They're there in equal quantities. We feel we're seeing them in different quantities. And I was really struck today by the beauty of the Albers that you have here in the National Museum. Anni, in weaving, was also interested in darkness, in light and darkness, in the sense of a city. There's something very urban about her weavings. She loved New York. She loved the spark of the city, the grid, the lights, the energy. And in a small weaving, Anni could capture the spirit of the city. And in a somewhat larger weaving called Open Letter, she made what she told me was her form of communication with Joseph, which had to do with nonverbal language, unspoken language, and surprise. So you see this, you initially think it's black, white, and gray, then you begin to see the orange in different places, then you begin to think you're seeing orange where you don't see it because of the quality of after image. But I think that this is a magnificent form of communication between two spouses, the infinity of the communication. And we will now look at Anni's memorial to the victims of the concentration camps called Six Prayers. And as you look at it, you'll hear a little bit of a Bach cello sonata, because it's so wonderful to follow the sounds as you follow Anni's threads, to feel how much can be done with so little, and above all, to feel the sheer emotion and beauty of these two works when experienced at the same time. Then Joseph, in 1962, began his homages, his platters to serve color, always with this relationship of nested squares. The measurements underneath the central square are doubled to the left and right of the central square and tripled above in all of his paintings of this series. He told me that his father taught him that when you paint a door, you start in the middle and you work your way out to catch all the drips, and so you don't get your cuffs dirty. And always Josef started in the middle, never put paint on top of a paint, did every work on a white gesso background, and with the same format, created so many beautiful voices for color. This, of course, is Vasarely. And here, too, I think the relationships, the visual relationships, certainly speak for themselves. They both had their work shown in a pivotal exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in the mid-1960s called The Responsive Eye, with Bridget Riley and some other painters in what was a very important moment in American art history. This is another Vasarely of a type that relates to Josef. And then we turn to Anni again. And we look at two prints that she made after going to the Salzburg Music Festival, where she was so struck by the wonder of violin bows in the air, and then violin bows lifted for the pizzicata, which you sense on the right. She was very interested in printing technique. These were done by a photo offset method, went through the press twice with varnish applied the second time on glossy paper. Anni was always caught up with the process. She said that as a child, when she and her sister would go to hear the Berlin Philharmonic, that her favorite moment was when the orchestra was tuning up, because it had to do with the components. It had to do with the process more than the finished results. And here I think you can have a sense of the wonder of the orchestra tuning up. And this is another work that came out of the process when by chance a negative fell on top of a Velox, an opaque form, and you got this wonderful overlap, and Anni called this work floating and equated it with the sight of the sheet music in the wind outdoors in Salzburg. We go from there to Vasarely again. I think the comparisons are quite clear. There's a similar energy. We go to Josef after that Vasarely, deliberately. And then we look at Breuer in Connecticut. The Alberses moved to Connecticut. The Breuers moved to New Canaan, Connecticut. They did a lot of houses in Litchfield, Connecticut. Anyone who likes Breuer's architecture, I love it, can have a field day in Connecticut with wonderful private houses, a public high school, a manufacturing plant, and so on. And Breuer would always have his clients buy work by Albers to put into their houses. And I'm told that this house has an Albers in it. Unfortunately, the photograph doesn't show it, but you can picture an Albers homage looking perfect in this wonderful example of Breuer's aesthetic. We look again at one of those adobes by Josef, or the variant series. Again, remember that there's an equal quantity of each color. This wonderful motion in and out, forwards and backwards, up and down, into space and flat. And there's something about these forms that I can't help relating to this house by Breuer, a wonderful structure in Connecticut, where you have those two beautiful shapes of the windows and something of the quality that Breuer would have seen in Josef's paintings. Anni, toward the end of her life, developed a very strong tremor with her right hand. She could no longer do straight lines, and she decided that rather than fight it, she had to go with it. So she did a series of prints based on stone walls and then hand-colored them, and they are, to me, a magnificent example of late work, of someone at the end of her life nobly overcoming the physical difficulty that she had while acknowledging it and making it part of her work. Josef in the squares became more and more interested in the celestial, in a sense of the sky, which he felt was so important to him. In 1976, in January, I went one day to visit the Alberses, and I said, "How are you today, Mr. Albers?" And Josef said, "Nicht so gut, Nick, schlecht." And I said, "What's the matter?" And he said, "I'm trying to paint an homage, and I need a particular color paint for the middle. And my goal in this homage is that the squares should not have boundaries or corners." And he said that in order to get the colors to work and achieve that, and to get the interaction of color that he wanted, where you get a feeling of colors glowing, he needed a certain Winsor Newton paint, cobalt green, number 196. And the new cobalt greens, number 205, just didn't do it. I called every art supply store in Connecticut. I couldn't find it. Finally, I called Winsor Newton's corporate headquarters. They're an English company, but I called them in New Jersey and got the president of the American branch on the phone. And I said, "I'm desperate to find tubes of cobalt green 196 for someone who isn't satisfied with cobalt green 205, even though they're supposed to be the same." And the man said to me, "But they're identical." And I said, "Sir, I'm calling for Josef Albers." Josef Albers. 2 days later, a box arrived at Birchwood Drive with 5 tubes of cobalt green from the original 196. And Josef was able to do this painting, and he said to me that he thought that the middle square was the cosmos. And then you had the sea and the earth. And he said he had to do a painting where the middle square was large. Many of his homages to the square in the format, the middle square is small. Here, it's big, it has this particular glow. And he said to me, the cosmos, of course, has no sharp corners, no boundaries. That's why he had to have the right color. And he said he needed it to be large in the middle because he said the cosmos is getting much nearer to me. 2 months later, he died. That was his last painting. Now, we're going to end tonight looking at a weaving by Anni's and a painting by Josef and listening to the incredible song, The Sunny Side of the Street, because essentially, the Albers' work is about celebration, optimism, going beyond materialism for incredible new forms of beauty. The Anni Albers weaving is called South of the Border. It's a celebration of the trips that Anni and Josef made to Mexico from Black Mountain College, which were very, very important journeys for them. And the painting by Josef is called Glow, one of the wonderful homages to the square. It was a great favorite of Barack Obama's, who borrowed it at one point for the White House. I think you feel the sense of belief and faith when you look at the work of Anni and Josef and listen to The Sunny Side of the Street. Life can be so sweet on the sunny side of the street, and to me, that's the great offering of the art of Anni and Josef Albers. Thank you.